The crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising in clouds against the cold Istanbul morning. The cobblestones of the imperial courtyard gleamed wet, washed clean before the spectacle. Soldiers in crimson uniforms lined the edges, their hands gripping spears not to hold back the condemned, but to restrain the audience itself. Peasants, merchants, and nobles alike summoned to witness the Sultan's judgment. At the center stood the prisoner, chained, beaten, his body trembling not from cold, but from terror. He knew this was not to be a swift execution. No blade would grant him mercy. His fate would be to bleed, to scream, to provide entertainment and warning in equal measure. At a signal from the Sultan, iron gates clanged open. From the shadows of the menagerie pit, a lion emerged, its mane ragged, its yellow eyes blazing with hunger. The crowd erupted in gasps and cries. The victim collapsed to his knees, sobbing prayers into the dirt, but none dared intercede. For in the Ottoman court, mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. The lion crept forward, slow at first. Then with a thunderous roar, it lunged. Flesh tore. The screams cut through the air, high, shrill, and unforgettable. And in that courtyard, beneath the watchful eyes of God's supposed shadow on earth, the Sultan himself, every man, woman, and child learned one lesson. Absolute power could not be questioned. This was not a battlefield. This was theatre, a macabre stage where cruelty was ritualized and fear became law. And though such spectacles were whispered about more than officially recorded, their impact was undeniable. These were not simple punishments. They were performances designed to haunt the imagination, ensuring obedience long after the blood had dried. The Ottoman Empire is often remembered as a glittering power, stretching across 3 continents. From the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna, it reigned for centuries as a colossus of trade, culture, and faith. Its rulers commissioned dazzling mosques, patronized poets and scholars, and shaped history with armies feared throughout Europe. Yet beneath the grandeur, behind the mosaics and silks, lurked a darker reality. An empire that built theaters of suffering, and rulers who turned executions into pageantry. If Rome had its gladiatorial arenas, the Ottomans crafted their own forms of horror. Less institutionalized perhaps, but no less terrifying. Consider the political backdrop. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the sultans ruled over a diverse empire of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, each with their own loyalties, each with potential to rebel. Paranoia seeped into the very walls of the palace. Brothers strangled at birth so they could never claim the throne. Advisors executed at the faintest whiff of betrayal. And for the common people, a constant reminder that the sultan's reach extended into their homes, their markets, their very souls. What better way to instill that fear than through public horrors? To let rebels die, not in silence, but in front of thousands, their agony feeding the legend of the sultan's wrath. It is easy to dismiss these accounts as exaggerations of European travelers, who often painted the Ottomans as savages to frighten their own countrymen. Yet fragments of Ottoman chronicles, court orders, and eyewitness accounts confirm that such spectacles did occur. Lions, tigers, even bears were kept in the menageries of the palace. Prisoners of war, condemned rebels, or disgraced nobles could be fed to these beasts, sometimes privately before the sultan, sometimes publicly for the masses. In either case, the message was the same. The sultan commanded life and death with divine authority. This was no ordinary empire. This was a world where cruelty was a tool of governance, where fear was sharpened like a blade, and where arenas were not built of stone like the Colosseum, but of people's memories, haunted by screams they could never forget. Tonight, we step into that world, into the shadows of the Ottoman palaces, the hidden pits of their menageries, and the whispered stories that reveal a side of history rarely taught in textbooks. Because the truth is simple. The most terrifying acts of power are not those that kill, but those that linger. And in the Ottoman Empire, horror was not just an accident of war or punishment. It was crafted, it was staged, it was inflicted deliberately, so that every soul who watched knew that disobedience meant not only death, but spectacle. And yet, the real horror was still to come. The Ottoman Sultan was more than a monarch. He was the caliph, the commander of the faithful, God's shadow on earth. His power was both political and spiritual, absolute and unquestionable. But with absolute power came absolute paranoia. And paranoia in the Ottoman court was cultivated like a deadly flower. From the moment a prince was born, his life was overshadowed by blood. Succession in the empire was never gentle. Brothers were not raised to rule side by side. They were rivals, competitors, threats. And so, when a new sultan ascended the throne, the first order of business was often fratricide. Infants, teenagers, young men, all strangled with silk bowstrings to avoid spilling royal blood, their bodies quietly removed while the court whispered prayers of obedience. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, the chroniclers insisted. It was necessity. Better the lives of a few princes than civil war across 3 continents. But for those who survived, the lesson was clear. In the Ottoman world, family itself could not be trusted. This paranoia spread outward from the palace walls. Viziers, generals, and governors lived under constant suspicion. A single rumor of treason, a whisper of disloyalty, and a man could find himself dragged before the sultan, stripped of rank, and sentenced to death in a spectacle of shame. Some were drowned in the Bosphorus, with weights tied to their legs. Others were paraded before the court, before the executioner's bowstring cut short their protests. The executions were swift, but the message was eternal. Loyalty was demanded, fear was the leash, and the sultan alone held it. But fear was not limited to the courtly elite. For the common people, fear was theatre. The sultan could have executed rebels quietly, in dungeons or deserted fields. Instead, he made sure the people watched. He turned punishment into pageantry. Traitors might be skinned alive in public squares. Thieves might be impaled, their bodies left to rot as a warning to all. And for crimes deemed particularly unforgivable, betrayal, heresy, rebellion, the punishment escalated into something far more grotesque, being thrown to the animals. The Sultan's private menageries were more than exotic displays of power. Lions, tigers, and bears, kept at great expense, were also instruments of psychological warfare. To release such beasts upon a human was to blur the line between man and prey, civilization and savagery. And it was a reminder that the Sultan's authority extended beyond human law. He controlled even the jaws of nature itself. Fear, then, was not merely a byproduct of power. It was the very foundation of it. The Ottoman sultans understood that empires are not held together by loyalty alone, nor by armies and treaties, but by the shared terror of disobedience. A subject who obeys from love may one day waver. A subject who obeys from fear never forgets. Yet beneath this system lay cracks that widened with every act of cruelty. Paranoia is never satisfied. The more the sultan feared betrayal, the more he demanded spectacles of loyalty, the more he staged horrors to reassert his dominance. But in doing so, he spread instability. Advisors schemed to direct his wrath toward rivals. Generals grew restless under constant suspicion. Even the janissaries, once his most loyal soldiers, raised from childhood to serve without question, began to realize they were pawns in a theater of blood. For the sultan, cruelty was control, but for the people it became legend. Each public horror birthed new whispers. Each spectacle of pain echoed in the streets, in the markets, in the minds of children who grew up believing their ruler was less a man and more a monster cloaked in divine sanction. The Ottomans' official proclamations spoke of justice, of order, of God's will. But the people who watched prisoners torn apart by lions saw something else. A ruler who wielded fear as both sword and crown. It is here, in the gulf between necessity and excess, between order and obsession, that the story of the empire's most brutal arena acts begins to take shape. For the spectacles were never simply about punishing criminals. They were about feeding the sultan's paranoia, keeping the court in line, and reminding every subject, high or low, that rebellion was not just death, it was humiliation, agony, and unforgettable terror. And yet, even this was only a prelude, because if fear was the sultan's weapon, then spectacle was his masterpiece. And the most horrifying performance of all was yet to unfold. The court was hushed. Even the rustle of silks, the scrape of armor, seemed to vanish beneath the oppressive silence. At the far end of the courtyard, the sultan reclined on his throne, eyes fixed coldly upon the condemned man dragged into the arena. This was no nameless thief or petty criminal. This was a rebel leader, once a respected noble, now branded a traitor. His rebellion had failed, his men slaughtered, his lands seized. Yet death alone would not satisfy the sultan's paranoia. No, this man would be made an example. The prisoner's name echoed through the courtyard as a herald shouted it for all to hear. Mothers pulled their children closer, merchants whispered to their apprentices, soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons. Everyone knew what was about to unfold would not be an execution. It would be a performance. The man was forced to his knees, chains clattering against the stone. His face was swollen from beatings, but his eyes still carried defiance. He spat in the direction of the throne, a final act of rebellion. The court gasped. The Sultan did not speak, but raised a single hand. That was the signal. The iron gates creaked open. From the darkness, the first lion padded forward, its mane catching the sunlight, its jaws dripping with froth. Another followed, then a third. The crowd recoiled. A wave of movement as people pressed back against the walls of the courtyard. The prisoner's breathing quickened. He tugged at his chains in desperation. The beasts circled him slowly at first, growling, testing, waiting for weakness. The man shouted prayers to God, his voice hoarse, breaking into sobs as the animals closed in. The Sultan leaned forward, his expression unreadable, his eyes glinting with what might have been curiosity or satisfaction. Then came the lunge. One lion struck his back, claws raking flesh, dragging him to the ground. He screamed, a sound so piercing that even hardened soldiers winced. The second lion clamped its jaws around his arm, tearing muscle from bone with a sickening crunch. Blood spurted across the cobblestones, darkening the stones where children once played in peacetime festivals. The prisoner tried to crawl, to reach the edge of the pit, but his body betrayed him. His leg was shredded by the third lion, which shook its head violently, ripping tendon and sinew. The screams turned to gurgles as the man's throat filled with blood. Some in the crowd covered their faces, others could not look away, and all the while, the Sultan watched. His hand never trembled, his gaze never faltered. This was not sport to him, not in the way Romans once cheered gladiators. This was a ritual, a declaration. A man who dared rise against him was reduced to nothing more than prey, torn apart before the eyes of thousands. The victim's final moments were a horror of twitching limbs and fading cries. At last, silence fell, broken only by the deep panting of the lions, their mouths red with gore. The body was unrecognizable, reduced to scraps of flesh and shattered bone. Soldiers moved forward to drag what remained away. The lions were herded back into their cages, their roars echoing long after they disappeared into the shadows. The audience was dismissed, but no one left unchanged. They had not merely witnessed justice, they had been forced to swallow a message carved in blood. The Sultan was untouchable, rebellion was futility, and suffering was the price of disobedience. Yet behind the spectacle lay motives more sinister than simple punishment. The rebel's execution was not merely about silencing dissent, it was about satisfying the Sultan's paranoia. Rumors whispered that he feared betrayal not just from nobles, but from his own family, his own guards, even his advisors. By staging such grotesque theatre, he ensured that fear bound them to him more tightly than loyalty ever could. The courtiers applauded weakly, their hands trembling, their eyes darting nervously to gauge the Sultan's mood. To clap too loudly was to seem eager for blood. To remain silent was to risk suspicion. The Sultan watched them all, noting every gesture, every hesitation, feeding his paranoia with their fear. And what of the people? Some stumbled home in silence, their faces pale. Others retold the story in hushed voices that night, embellishing the details, ensuring the terror spread through the city like wildfire. Children lay awake, imagining lions in the shadows. Parents whispered warnings about obedience. And the legend of the Sultan's cruelty grew ever stronger. In the annals of history, such moments are recorded in fragments, travelers' diaries, official proclamations, gossip turned into chronicles. But for those who were there, it was unforgettable. The smell of blood, the sound of screams, the image of lions tearing a man apart under the approving gaze of their ruler. These things could not be erased. This was not justice. This was not order. This was theatre of fear, carefully orchestrated to remind everyone in attendance that the Sultan did not simply rule, he consumed. But as with all spectacles of cruelty, such acts carried consequences. For while they cowed the people into obedience, they also planted seeds of unease, of resentment, of whispers in the dark. And in the gilded halls of the palace, behind closed doors, conspiracies began to take shape. The lion pit was only the surface. What the trembling crowd saw in the courtyard, a rebel torn apart, a sultan's cold gaze, was but the visible mask of power. The real story lay deeper in the echoing chambers of Topkapi Palace, where whispers carried more weight than swords, and secrets were as deadly as poison. For the Ottoman court was not merely a seat of government, it was a labyrinth of ambition. Viziers schemed against rivals, eunuchs wielded influence in the shadows, and the women of the Sultan's harem played their own games of power, shaping dynasties with a whisper in the right ear or a dagger in the dark. Every execution, every spectacle of horror, was not only punishment but a political maneuver, carefully timed, carefully staged, to serve the hidden battles raging within the palace walls. Behind the rebel's execution lay layers of betrayal invisible to the public. Some said the rebel had once been a trusted ally, his rise encouraged by rival viziers eager to weaken the Sultan's grip. Others whispered that his rebellion was exaggerated, a convenient excuse to rid the court of a dangerous noble who knew too much. In the Ottoman Empire, truth and lies were inseparable. What mattered was not what happened, but what could be believed. And the spectacle in the courtyard was the proof the Sultan needed to justify his paranoia. Consider the Grand Viziers, the empire's most powerful ministers. They were indispensable to governance, but also the most frequent victims of sudden suspicion. A Grand Vizier might guide the empire through wars and reforms for years, only to be seized one morning, stripped of titles, and executed by strangulation before his household could even mourn. And yet, many of these executions were not truly about treason. They were about removing rivals, consolidating influence, and silencing those who knew the empire's darkest secrets. Religious hypocrisy fueled these decisions. The Sultan, after all, was both ruler and defender of the faith. Publicly, scholars and judges, the ulama, proclaimed these spectacles as justice, divinely sanctioned. Rebellion was not merely treason, it was a sin against God's order. But privately, the same scholars benefited from the Sultan's favor, securing wealth, estates, and prestige by twisting law into a weapon of fear. The lion's claws might tear the flesh, but the ulama's words tore away any hope of mercy. And then there was the harem, behind gilded screens and guarded chambers. The Sultan's wives, concubines, and mothers, the Valid sultans, pulled invisible strings. A single whispered accusation could doom a vizier, a general, or even a prince. Women who could not wield swords wielded influence through gossip, manipulation, and alliances with eunuchs who controlled access to the Sultan's person. The harem was a theater of its own, and many of the public spectacles of cruelty that horrified the empire were born from rivalries within those silken chambers. The irony was suffocating. While the Sultan proclaimed divine justice in the courtyard, his palace seethed with corruption, betrayal, and hypocrisy. Nobles who applauded the rebels' bloody end might that very night conspire to engineer a similar fate for one another. Eunuchs carried notes between secret factions. Janissary captains whispered their discontent in candlelit barracks. Every act of cruelty created more fear, and every ounce of fear fed more conspiracies. Whispers spread like wildfire. The story of the rebels' execution took on lives of its own. Some said the Sultan himself had smiled as the lions ripped the man apart. Others swore the lions were starved deliberately for days to heighten their ferocity. Still others believed the man's rebellion was entirely fabricated, that he had been guilty only of speaking too freely in the wrong company. These versions of the story mattered less than their effect. They deepened the atmosphere of distrust, convincing both court and commoner alike that no one, not even the most loyal servant, was safe. In this suffocating atmosphere, men and women learned to wear masks. Courtiers spoke in riddles, flattering the Sultan in public while plotting his overthrow in private. Generals carried out executions with unwavering discipline, but returned home to whisper curses against the throne. Mothers wept for their sons sent to die in campaigns, but reminded their children never to speak ill of the Sultan. The empire's splendor, its grand mosques, its palaces glittering with jewels, all were built on a foundation of fear and deception. And so, the rebel's death was not an isolated cruelty. It was part of a pattern, a rhythm of terror orchestrated by a ruler who trusted no one, who saw betrayal in every shadow. The lions tore his enemy apart in public, but the real predators stalked the palace corridors. Viziers hungry for power, concubines hungry for influence, and janissaries hungry for freedom from the Sultan's chains. The horror was not only in the blood spilled, but in the knowledge that at any moment anyone, noble, scholar, soldier, even prince, could find themselves in the center of the arena, their fate sealed not by guilt, but by rumor. The lions were terrifying, but the whispers were worse. And still, the consequences of such terror had yet to be revealed, because for all the Sultan's calculated cruelty, there comes a moment in every reign when fear no longer binds, when blood no longer silences. And in the Ottoman Empire, that moment would change everything. The Sultan's spectacle did not end in the courtyard. It followed the people home. It clung to them in whispers shared at markets, in lullabies twisted into warnings, in the nervous glances exchanged whenever soldiers passed through the streets. To live under the shadow of the Ottoman throne was to live not only with taxes and decrees, but with memories of blood and beasts that lingered long after the screams had faded. For the nobility, the meaning of these public horrors was clear. The Sultan's grip was unshakable. Nobles who watched a fellow courtier torn to pieces were reminded that privilege offered no shield. They could ride in carriages plated with gold, dine on delicacies from every corner of the empire. But one whispered accusation could strip it all away in a heartbeat. The spectacle of violence was not only a punishment for the guilty, it was a warning to the powerful that even their rank was fragile, their lives expendable in the theater of fear. For the common people, the effect was different but no less profound. They saw in these events not politics, but proof of divine wrath. Religious scholars, the ulama, were quick to frame the Sultan's cruelty as justice. A rebel was not just a traitor to the Sultan, but to God himself. To be devoured by lions, to be impaled or strangled, was painted as the righteous fate of those who strayed from obedience. This framing allowed the people to process the horror, to make sense of the cruelty. But it also spread fear like a contagion. If disobedience led to such grisly fates, then silence became survival. And yet silence was not the same as acceptance. Among commoners, stories took on lives of their own. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with tales of lions prowling in the Sultan's dungeons, waiting for the wicked. Merchants muttered that the Sultan was cursed, that his appetite for blood would one day consume the empire itself. Children played games reenacting executions, laughing as one pretended to be the Sultan and another the condemned, a chilling normalization of violence woven into the very fabric of daily life. Religion was the sharpest, double-edged sword in this cultural theater. The Sultan's role as caliph, defender of Islam, gave him sacred authority to command life and death. But it also forced him to maintain a moral facade. Public executions were cloaked in ritual and prayer, turning butchery into ceremony. Yet beneath that thin veneer of sanctity, hypocrisy thrived. Scholars enriched themselves by justifying cruelty. Imams preached obedience to rulers, even as the same rulers indulged in acts of debauchery and paranoia that contradicted the moral code they claimed to uphold. The cultural impact extended beyond the empire's borders. European travelers carried stories of these spectacles back to Venice, Paris, and London. They described the Ottomans as barbaric despots, rulers who fed men to beasts like ancient Romans resurrected in the East. These tales stoked fear and fascination, reinforcing the image of the Ottoman Empire as a cruel alien power. For Europeans, the stories became propaganda. For the Ottomans, they became reputation, one that both intimidated enemies and deepened the sense of isolation from the Christian West. But within the empire, the effect was subtler and more corrosive. Violence had become ritualized, expected. The people did not revolt after each bloody spectacle. Instead, they adapted. Fear hardened into caution, caution into silence, silence into complicity. The Sultan's cruelty seeped into the social fabric until it felt inevitable, unchangeable, as natural as the call to prayer echoing over the city at dawn. And yet, even within this culture of silence, resentment grew. Commoners whispered that the Sultan's cruelty was a sign of weakness, not strength. Janissaries, once the Sultan's fiercest loyalists, began to see themselves less as servants and more as potential kingmakers, emboldened by the fear that surrounded them. Nobles, weary of watching their peers paraded to their deaths, began to wonder whether terror could be turned against the throne itself. Thus, the the cultural impact of the Sultan's spectacles was double-edged. On the surface, they reinforced obedience, sanctified by religion and embedded in daily life. But beneath, they eroded trust, fostered resentment, and spread the belief that the Sultan ruled not through divine right, but through brutality alone. And when people believe a ruler's power rests only on fear, the day inevitably comes when fear ceases to bind. That moment, the breaking point, would be the empire's undoing. For cruelty, no matter how carefully staged, cannot hold an empire forever. And when cruelty becomes the spectacle of state, it is only a matter of time before the curtain falls. For years, the Ottoman throne thrived on terror. Every execution, every lion pit, every body displayed in the streets reinforced the Sultan's power. But cruelty, like a blade, dulls with overuse. What once shocked began to numb. What once silenced began to stir unrest. And eventually, the very fear that kept the empire obedient began to erode the foundations of its rule. The turning point came not with one act of cruelty, but with excess. A sultan, whether Murad IV with his iron fist or Ibrahim the Mad with his erratic paranoia, crossed the invisible line where fear became contempt. When rulers mistake spectacle for strength, they lose sight of the delicate balance that sustains power. And in the Ottoman Empire, that balance was shattered. Consider Murad IV, famous for his bans on coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. He roamed the streets of Istanbul in disguise, executing anyone who dared disobey. A man could be killed for a sip of coffee, his body left to rot as warning. At first, the people trembled, but as bodies piled high, fear gave way to bitterness. Mothers cursed his name behind closed doors. Janissaries muttered in their barracks, their loyalty stretched thin. Murad's cruelty, once seen as discipline, became tyranny, a ruler obsessed with control, strangled by his own paranoia. Then came Ibrahim the Far, remembered by history as Ibrahim the Mad. His reign was a spiral into lunacy. He drowned entire harems in the Bosphorus on suspicion of betrayal. He ordered lavish feasts while his people starved. He staged humiliations and spectacles of cruelty, not as tools of governance, but as personal indulgence. The people no longer feared divine justice. They saw madness unrestrained. And madness, once recognized, breeds revolt. The palace itself began to fracture. Viziers who once cheered executions now whispered of incompetence. Janissaries, who had long been the Sultan's iron fist, began to rebel openly, demanding reforms, deposing rulers they deemed unfit. The very soldiers who had once enforced fear now turned it against the throne. And among the people, something shifted. They had once looked upon the lion pits and public executions with awe and terror. Now they looked with disgust. Parents shielded their children not just from the horror, but from the humiliation of living under rulers who treated death as theatre. Rumors spread that the Sultan had lost God's favor, that his cruelty was no longer justice but sin. And when religion turned against him, the Sultan's authority cracked. The real horror was not the lions, the impalements, the strangulations. It was the realization that none of it worked anymore. Fear could not hold a fractured empire. In some provinces, governors defied orders, ruling like independent kings. In others, rebellions simmered, fueled not by defiance of Ottoman might, but by exhaustion from Ottoman cruelty. The court itself began to unravel. Eunuchs who once whispered obedience now whispered sedition. Harem women who had manipulated politics for decades now plotted the Sultan's removal. The bowstring that had silenced so many rivals now threatened the throne itself. In a cruel twist of fate, the same paranoia that had driven the spectacles of horror became the Sultan's undoing. For when you trust no one, you are left with no allies when rebellion comes. And rebellion did come. Janissaries stormed the palace gates. Nobles withdrew their support. Religious scholars, once complicit, declared the Sultan unfit to rule. The spectacle of cruelty that had once paralyzed the people now inspired them to rise, to overthrow, to end the cycle of blood. The condemned rebel in the lion pit had screamed alone, his agony swallowed by silence. But now the people themselves roared. They would no longer accept terror as governance, nor cruelty as justice. And as the palace walls shook with revolt, the Sultan learned a truth his lions could never teach. Fear is powerful, but it is not eternal. This was the turning point. The moment when brutality ceased to bind and began to break. The moment when the theatre of horror collapsed, revealing not strength, but weakness. And from this collapse, the empire itself would never fully recover. The lions were caged again, the bowstrings were put away, but the memory of those spectacles, the screams, the blood, the staged horrors, would linger. And though the rulers who followed tried to rebuild order, they could never erase the knowledge that cruelty had failed. The empire that once held 3 continents in its grasp had revealed its own fragility. The turning point was not the death of a man in an arena, it was the death of the illusion that cruelty could rule forever. The lion pits fell silent, the bowstrings tightened on fewer necks. The great theatre of cruelty that had once defined Ottoman rule faded, not because mercy triumphed, but because fear had outlived its usefulness. When the spectacles turned from awe to disgust, from obedience to rebellion, the empire learned too late that terror is a poison, powerful in small doses, fatal in excess. The immediate consequences were unmistakable. Ibrahim the Mad, whose paranoia and indulgence had pushed the empire to the brink, was dragged from his chambers by the Janissaries, strangled by the very bowstring he had once wielded against rivals. Murad IV's iron fist left the empire disciplined but brittle, held together not by loyalty, but by dread. Each spectacle of cruelty, each execution paraded as theatre, weakened the fabric of trust that bound ruler to subject. And in an empire as vast and diverse as the Ottoman, once trust eroded, fracture was inevitable. Chroniclers of the time left conflicting accounts. Ottoman historians, writing under the shadow of the throne, cloaked cruelty in the language of justice. They spoke of rebels punished, traitors humbled, God's will enacted through the Sultan's hand. But European travelers and diplomats wrote of barbarity. Men fed to lions, women drowned in sacks, nobles butchered without trial. Whether embellished or true, these stories crossed borders and spread through taverns, courts, and churches across Europe, painting the empire as a realm of oriental despotism. The truth was likely somewhere in between, but perception mattered more than fact, and the perception that the Ottomans ruled through terror stuck. For later rulers, the lesson was clear, though not always heeded. Some sought to reform, to temper the use of spectacle, to build legitimacy through law, diplomacy, or patronage of the arts. Others clung to cruelty, repeating the mistakes of their predecessors, only to face rebellion or deposition in turn. The Janissaries, once the executioners of the Sultan's will, became kingmakers, toppling rulers they deemed unfit. Fear, which had once chained them to obedience, now became the weapon they turned against the throne. The legacy of these horrors lingered not only in politics, but in culture. Folk songs, whispered tales, and even proverbs carried the memory of cruelty. Parents warned their children with stories of lions devouring traitors, of bowstrings silencing princes in the night. These were not simply warnings of disobedience, but reminders that the empire itself was a place where life could be taken without reason, where power was as unpredictable as it was absolute. Archaeological traces remain, the foundations of palace menageries, fragments of chronicles, the bones of men and animals alike buried beneath Istanbul's soil. But more enduring than ruins are the psychological scars. The Ottomans' reliance on terror ensured obedience in the moment, but bred distrust that lasted generations. Even